a 120-year-old family photo found, and what they notice. Behind the curtain leaves, everyone's silent. The summer heat pressed against the windows of the old house in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, as Sarah Mitchell climbed the narrow stairs to her grandmother's attic. Dust particles danced in the afternoon light streaming through a small circular window. Her grandmother had passed 3 months ago at 94, and Sarah had finally found the courage to sort through decades of accumulated memories. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, each one a time capsule waiting to be opened. Sarah pulled down a leather trunk, its brass clasps tarnished with age. Inside, beneath yellowed newspapers from 1952 and her grandmother's wedding dress, she found a metal box decorated with faded roses. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Photographs spilled out, some so old they were printed on thick cardboard with ornate borders. One image immediately caught her attention. The photo showed a family gathering outside a 2-story wooden house, the kind common in small Midwestern towns at the turn of the century. Men in dark suits and women in long dresses stood in formal poses, their expressions serious, as was customary for photographs of that era. Sarah brought the image closer to the window, squinting at the faded inscription on the back. Mitchell family, September 1905, Main Street. Her great-great-grandparents, she realized, her heart quickening. She had heard stories about them, but had never seen their faces. The house behind them was modest but well-maintained, with lace curtains visible in the windows. Something about those curtains drew her eye. Sarah pulled out her phone and used the camera to zoom in on the details, a trick her daughter had taught her for examining old photographs. That's when she saw it. Behind one of the curtains, partially obscured but unmistakable, was a small face pressed against the glass. A child watching the family gathering from inside the house. But this child wasn't in the formal group outside. The face was thin, almost haunting, with eyes that seemed to stare directly through time. Sarah's breath caught. Who was this child, and why weren't they in the family photo? Sarah sat at her kitchen table that evening, the photograph placed carefully on a clean white cloth. She had made 3 cups of tea, forgetting to drink each one as they grew cold. The image seemed different now, heavier somehow, weighted with a mystery she couldn't explain. She called her brother Thomas in Chicago. "You need to see something," she said without preamble. "Can you video call?" Thomas's face appeared on her phone screen, his reading glasses perched on his nose. "What's going on? You sound strange." Sarah held the photograph up to her camera, explaining what she had found. Thomas leaned closer to his screen, his expression shifting from casual interest to intense focus. "Send me a high-resolution scan," he said. "I want to see this properly." An hour later, they were both staring at the same digital image on their respective computers. Thomas had enhanced the brightness and contrast, making the face behind the curtain even more visible. It was definitely a child, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with dark hair and a dress that seemed different from the fine clothes worn by the family outside. "This doesn't make sense," Thomas said. "Why would there be a child inside during a family photo? And look at the positioning. They're not just standing there casually. They're watching, almost like they're not supposed to be seen." Sarah had been wondering the same thing. She pulled out the other photographs from the metal box, spreading them across her table. There were images of her great-great-grandfather's general store, pictures of church gatherings, a few portraits, but nothing that explained the mysterious child. "We need to find out who lived in that house," Sarah said. "The inscription says Main Street, 1905. That house might still be standing, or at least there might be records." Thomas nodded slowly. "I'll be there this weekend. Don't do anything until I arrive. This feels important, Sarah. I don't know why, but this feels like something we need to understand." After they hung up, Sarah returned to the photograph. The child's eyes seemed to follow her around the room. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and a cool breeze that promised autumn wasn't far away. Thomas had driven through the night, arriving at Sarah's house just after dawn with coffee and determination. The Cedar Rapids Historical Society occupied a renovated Carnegie Library on 2nd Avenue. Margaret, the society's director, greeted them with the enthusiasm of someone who loved her work. She was in her 60s, with silver hair pulled into a practical bun and eyes that lit up when Sarah mentioned they had an old photograph to research. 1905, Margaret repeated, adjusting her glasses as she examined the image on Sarah's tablet. That's a fascinating period in Cedar Rapids history. The city was growing rapidly, lots of industrial development. She paused, zooming in on the background. "This house, I recognize this architectural style. Second Empire, very popular in the 1880s and 90s. The mansard roof, those decorative brackets. Do you know the exact address?" Sarah shook her head. "Just Main Street. My great-great-grandfather owned a general store somewhere in town." Margaret's fingers flew across her computer keyboard. Mitchell, you said? Let me check our business directories. Minutes passed as she scrolled through digitized records. Here we are. Mitchell General Store, 412 Main Street, owned by Jonathan and Martha Mitchell from 1898 to 1920. She pulled up another window, this one showing a city map from 1905. The store was on the corner of Main and 3rd. Their residence would have been... She traced the map with her finger. Right here, 410 Main Street, the building next door. Thomas leaned forward. Is that building still standing? Margaret smiled sadly. No, I'm afraid it was demolished in 1962 to make way for a parking structure. But we have extensive records. Give me a moment. She disappeared into the archives room, returning with a large leather-bound volume. City Directory, 1905. This lists every resident and business. She flipped through the pages, running her finger down columns of names. Mitchell, Jonathan, proprietor. Mitchell, Martha, his wife. And... She paused, her expression growing curious. That's odd. What? Sarah asked. There's no mention of children living at that address, but I know the Mitchells had 3 children by 1905. Margaret pulled out another record book, this one marked Census Records 1900 at 1910. She laid it open beside the city directory, comparing entries with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years piecing together historical puzzles. Here's the 1900 census, she said, pointing to a line of careful handwriting. Jonathan Mitchell, age 32, merchant. Martha Mitchell, age 29. 3 children, Robert, age 8, Elizabeth, age 6, and Thomas, age 4. She looked up at them. But in the 1905 city directory, those children aren't listed as residing at the Main Street address. Sarah felt a chill despite the warm room. Where were they? That's what's strange, Margaret said. Children were usually listed with their parents unless... She trailed off, reaching for another volume. Let me check something. Thomas caught Sarah's eye. They were both thinking the same thing. The child in the photograph wasn't a Mitchell child. Margaret returned with a thinner book, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. School enrollment records, Cedar Rapids Elementary Schools, 1905-1906. She scanned the pages, her frown deepening. The Mitchell children were enrolled in Cedar Rapids Elementary School No. 2 on the east side of town. The better school, she added quietly, which means they probably weren't living above the store anymore. The family had likely moved to a nicer neighborhood. But someone was living there, Sarah said, touching the photograph on her tablet screen. This child. Margaret nodded slowly. During that period, it was common for business owners to rent out living spaces above their shops. Let me check rental records and business licenses. She moved to her computer again, pulling up scanned documents from the county archives. What she found made the room feel suddenly colder. In 1905, the residence at 410 Main Street was registered as a boarding house, Margaret said quietly, operated by a Mrs. Helen Crawford. She had a license to house up to 12 residents, and according to this notation, she leaned closer to the screen. Many of her boarders were employed at the Cedar Rapids Cotton Mill 3 blocks away. The cotton mill. Sarah had heard about it in local history classes decades ago. It had been one of the largest employers in the area during the early 1900s. Were children working there? Thomas asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Margaret's expression was grim. Hundreds of them. The Cedar Rapids Public Library's archives were located in the basement, where the temperature stayed cool year-round. Margaret had given them the name of a colleague, David, a retired professor who specialized in local labor history. He met them at the library entrance, a tall man with kind eyes and hands stained with the ink of old newspapers. The cotton mill, David said as he led them through rows of filing cabinets, was Cedar Rapids' dirty secret. Between 1890 and 1915, it employed over 300 workers at its peak. At least 40% were children under the age of 14. He pulled out a folder thick with photocopied documents and spread them across a research table. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. The children operated dangerous machinery, cleaned under running equipment, and breathed air thick with cotton fibers. Lung disease was rampant. Sarah felt sick. The face in the photograph suddenly made terrible sense. That thin, haunted expression. The child had been watching a family gathering from inside a boarding house, probably exhausted from a factory shift. David handed them a newspaper clipping from 1906. Its headline stark, "Mill Accident Claims Young Life." Sarah read the article, her hands shaking. A 9-year-old girl had been killed when her hair was caught in machinery. The factory had paid her family $12 in compensation. Were there any photographs? Thomas asked quietly. Any documentation of what conditions were like? David nodded. That's the remarkable thing. In 1905 and 1906, there was a movement nationally to expose child labor conditions. Photographers and journalists were beginning to document these abuses. Louis Hine became famous for his child labor photographs a few years later. But here in Cedar Rapids, we had our own documentation, though it was less official. He pulled out a manila envelope. These photographs were found in the basement of the old mill building when it was being converted to lofts in 2003. Someone, we don't know who, had been documenting the workers. Look at these. Sarah and Thomas leaned over the photographs. Children stood at enormous looms, their small frames dwarfed by machinery. Young girls carried heavy baskets of cotton. Boys with ancient eyes stared into the camera, their hands already gnarled from labor. And there, in the third photograph, was a face that made Sarah's heart stop. The same child from behind the curtain. David noticed their reaction immediately. "You recognize her?" Sarah placed her family photograph next to the mill worker image. The resemblance was undeniable. Same thin face, same dark eyes, same expression of wary exhaustion. In the mill photograph, the child wore a simple cotton dress and stood beside a massive spinning frame, her hands positioned as if she'd been interrupted mid-work. "Who was she?" Thomas asked. David turned the photograph over carefully. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Anna, frame 7, September 1905. "Anna," Sarah whispered. "The same month as the family photograph." David pulled out a ledger from another box. The mill kept employment records, though they're incomplete and often falsified. "Let me see." He ran his finger down columns of names. "Here, Anna K., hired August 1905, age listed as 14. But there's a notation in different ink. Someone wrote, actual age approximately 9. 9 years old, working 12-hour days in a cotton mill, living in a boarding house 3 blocks from where Sarah's prosperous great-great-grandparents ran their general store." The law at the time was murky, David explained. Iowa had passed some child labor restrictions in 1897, but enforcement was practically non-existent. Factory owners routinely lied about children's ages, and desperate families needed the income. Anna was probably making about $3 a week. A family might have 4 or 5 children working to survive. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off Anna's face in the mill photograph. Why was she in the boarding house above my family's store? Did they know she was there? David shrugged. The Mitchells owned the building. They would have known Mrs. Crawford was running a boarding house, whether they knew about the children working in the mill. He paused delicately. Many people chose not to ask questions. Thomas pulled out his laptop. The photograph was taken outside the building. The Mitchells were having their family portrait made right there on the street. Anna was inside, behind the curtain, watching. Why would she be watching? Maybe, Sarah said slowly, she had never seen anything like it. A family, together, dressed in fine clothes, smiling. Maybe to her, that looked like something from another world. The room was quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. David reached for another folder. "There's something else you should know. In late 1905, something happened that changed everything." David opened the folder to reveal a stack of newspaper clippings, all from October and November 1905. The headlines told a story of outrage and reform. Citizens demand mill inspection, child labor conditions exposed, factory reforms promised. In October 1905, David explained, a series of articles appeared in the Cedar Rapids Gazette exposing conditions at the cotton mill. They were detailed, specific, and accompanied by evidence that couldn't be ignored. The public response was immediate and furious. He spread out the articles. Sarah leaned in, reading the descriptions of children working in dangerous conditions, of families trapped in poverty, of mill owners who valued profit over human life. One article featured testimonies from workers, including a passage that made her breath catch. A child of 9 years, known only as Anna, works from dawn until dark at frame 7. When asked about her family, she could only say they were somewhere south, suggesting she had been separated from her parents and sent north to work. This created a scandal, David continued. The mayor formed a commission. The state sent inspectors. Within 6 months, Iowa passed stronger child labor laws, and the Cedar Rapids mill was forced to make significant changes. They had to verify ages, limit hours, improve safety conditions. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Thomas was scrolling through something on his laptop. "I'm looking at state archives online. There was a hearing in November 1905. Factory owners were questioned. Records were examined." He paused, his expression changing. "And someone submitted photographic evidence." "Photographic evidence?" Sarah repeated. David nodded slowly. "That's the mystery. Someone provided photographs to the commission, clear documentation of the conditions and the children working there. but the photographer was never identified. The commission records only note that visual evidence was presented by a concerned citizen who wished to remain anonymous. Sarah picked up the mill photograph of Anna. "This photograph, the ones you showed us from the mill. Could these be the evidence?" "Possibly," David said. "But there were more photographs submitted to the commission than what survived in the mill building. According to the hearing records, at least 20 photographs were presented. We've only found 8. The 3 of them sat in silence, considering the implications. Someone in Cedar Rapids in 1905 had systematically documented child labor conditions, kept the photographs hidden, then presented them as evidence at exactly the right moment to create change. "We need to find out who took these photographs," Thomas said, "and how they got access to the mill to take them in the first place." Sarah and Thomas spent the next 3 days diving deep into research. They examined property records, business licenses, and newspaper archives. They studied every face in the family photograph, looking for clues they might have missed. It was Sarah who made the connection. She was looking at the family photograph for perhaps the 100th time, this time examining not the child behind the curtain, but the family members themselves. Her great-great-grandfather Jonathan stood in the center, dignified and prosperous. Beside him was Martha, his wife, and their 3 children, all dressed in their finest clothes. But standing slightly apart from the main family group was another figure, a young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, wearing a simpler dress than the others. She held something in her hands, something Sarah had dismissed as a purse or small bag. She zoomed in on the image, enhancing it as much as her phone's camera would allow. It wasn't a purse, it was a camera, a small folding camera, the kind that was becoming popular in the early 1900s for amateur photographers. Sarah's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the figure with the census records Margaret had shown them. In the 1905 city directory, there was an entry they hadn't paid attention to. Catherine Miller, age 23, boarder at the Mitchell residence, occupation, clerk at Mitchell General Store. She called Thomas immediately. "I found her, the photographer. I think it was Catherine Miller." They met with David and Margaret the next morning. Margaret pulled up everything she could find about Catherine Miller. The trail was faint but telling. Catherine had arrived in Cedar Rapids in early 1904, hired as a clerk in the Mitchell store. She had no family in the area, having come from Pennsylvania. The city directory listed her as a boarder in the Mitchell household. "But here's what's interesting," Margaret said, pulling up another record. In early 1906, right after the mill reforms were implemented, Catherine Miller left Cedar Rapids. She moved to Chicago, where she went to work for a settlement house, an organization that helped immigrant families and advocated for labor reform. David added his own findings. "I contacted the settlement house, which still exists. Their historical records show that Catherine Miller worked there until 1912, specifically in their child welfare department. She helped draft Illinois' child labor legislation in 1909. The picture was becoming clear. Catherine Miller, a young woman working in the Mitchell store, had witnessed the child laborers who lived in the boarding house above. She had access to a camera. She had been in a position to move between different social worlds, the prosperous merchant family and the desperate workers. She took the photographs, Sarah said with certainty. She documented what she saw, and then she submitted them anonymously to protect herself, and maybe to protect the Mitchell family from scrutiny. Thomas pulled up the family photograph again, studying Catherine's face. She's standing apart from the family, not quite part of them, but not completely separate either. And she's holding that camera almost protectively. With Catherine Miller identified as the likely photographer, Sarah and Thomas worked to piece together what had happened in September 1905. They found more census records, immigration documents, and eventually, through genealogy websites, they traced Anna's full story. Anna Kowalski had arrived in New York in August 1905 with a group of immigrant children. Her parents had died during the voyage from Poland, and she was separated from her siblings at Ellis Island. A labor contractor had brought her to Cedar Rapids, promising work and housing. She was 9 years old. Mrs. Crawford's boarding house had housed a dozen such children, all working at the cotton mill. The conditions were exactly as the newspaper articles described: grueling hours, dangerous work, inadequate food, and no education. But Catherine Miller had been watching. Through correspondence David found in the settlement house archives, they discovered letters Catherine had written to a friend in Pennsylvania. In one, dated September 1905, she wrote, "I see them leaving for the mill before dawn, these children who should be in school. I see them return after dark, so exhausted they can barely climb the stairs. I have begun to document what I witness. Someone must bear witness, even if I cannot yet speak openly." The family photograph took on new meaning. On that September day, the Mitchell family had gathered for a formal portrait. a display of prosperity and respectability. Catherine had been included as part of the household, but she stood apart, her camera in hand. And upstairs, in the boarding house window, Anna had watched, a ghost at the feast, invisible to the formal gathering below, but captured forever by the camera's lens. The photograph Catherine took of Anna at the mill had likely been taken just days before or after the family portrait. She had gained access to the mill, perhaps posing as a potential investor or using her connection to the Mitchell family. She had systematically documented the children, the conditions, the machinery. And then, when the moment was right, when public sentiment was turning against child labor, she had submitted the photographs anonymously to the commission. David found one more piece of the puzzle. In November 1905, a small notation in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned that the cotton mill had been forced to release all workers under the age of 12. Older children's hours were limited, and safety conditions improved. Anna Kowalski, according to mill records, was released from employment on November 18, 1905. David tracked her further through census records. She appeared in the 1910 census in Chicago, age 14, attending school and living in a settlement house. The same settlement house where Catherine Miller worked. Sarah stood before a gathering of about 40 people in the Cedar Rapids Historical Society's meeting room. 2 months had passed since she first found the photograph in her grandmother's attic. The image that had started as a simple family portrait now told a much deeper story. On the wall behind her, projected large enough for everyone to see, was the family photograph. Next to it, the photograph of Anna at the mill. And beside those, a third image that David had helped them uncover. A photograph of Catherine Miller from 1910, standing outside the Chicago settlement house, surrounded by children. In the front row was a teenage girl with familiar dark eyes. Anna. Catherine Miller saved these children, Sarah said to the assembled crowd, not just by documenting their suffering, but by acting on what she witnessed. After the reforms were implemented in Cedar Rapids, she moved to Chicago and helped Anna and others like her escape the cycle of exploitation. She gave them education, opportunity, and hope. Thomas had flown in for the presentation, along with other Mitchell family descendants who had learned about the discovery. They had all contributed to the research, piecing together the story from fragments of history. For years, our family had this photograph, Sarah continued. We saw a prosperous merchant family, a moment frozen in time. We never noticed the child behind the curtain. We never asked who else might have been present but invisible in our family history. Margaret had helped them establish a small exhibit at the Historical Society. It included the photographs, the newspaper articles, and the story of Catherine Miller and Anna Kowalski. But more than that, it included the names of all the children they could identify who had worked at the Cedar Rapids cotton mill, pulling them from invisibility into historical record. David spoke next, providing historical context about child labor reform movements and how individuals like Catherine had created change through quiet courage and systematic documentation. He explained how the reforms sparked by the 1905 Commission eventually contributed to broader state and federal child labor laws. After the presentation, people lingered, examining the photographs, asking questions. An elderly woman approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "My grandmother worked in that mill," she said quietly. "She was 12. She never spoke about it, but I found her employment card after she passed. Seeing these photographs, seeing someone who cared enough to document what happened, it means something." As Sarah drove home that evening, the autumn sun setting over Cedar Rapids, she thought about the power of what remains hidden in plain sight. The child behind the curtain had been there all along, waiting to be seen, her story waiting to be told. Catherine Miller had seen her, had made sure she was not forgotten. And now, 120 years later, Anna's face would be remembered not as a nameless victim of history, but as a real child whose suffering had sparked change. The photograph that Sarah had found in her grandmother's attic had revealed more than a family secret. It had revealed a story of courage, justice, and the power of bearing witness. The next week, Sarah received an email from a genealogy researcher in Chicago. Someone had found more of Catherine Miller's photographs in the archives of the settlement house, including several of Anna as she grew older, attended school, and eventually became a teacher herself. Anna had lived until 1982, the researcher wrote. She had spent her life as an educator, teaching immigrant children in Chicago public schools. She had never married, but she had been beloved by hundreds of students over her long career. Attached to the email was one final photograph, Anna in 1975, elderly but with the same unmistakable eyes, standing in her classroom surrounded by children's artwork. On her desk, barely visible but definitely there, was a framed photograph. Sarah zoomed in. It was the image of Catherine Miller outside the settlement house from 1910. The photograph Anna had kept for 65 years, Two women connected across time by a camera's lens and a commitment to justice. One who had documented the truth and one who had survived to tell it. Sarah added the photograph to the Historical Society exhibit. In the description, she wrote simply, Anna Kowalski, 1896-1982, teacher, survivor, witness, remembered. The child behind the curtain was finally fully seen.